which as we know has been Mental Health Week, was it Mental Health Month. Anyway, it's in particular the week in which we honour those suffering from mental illnesses or disorders and those who live with them, love them and or care for them, including the health services attending them. Next week, fittingly, is Carers Week, recognising and celebrating the outstanding contribution unpaid carers make in many walks, but obviously amongst those with mental illnesses and disabilities. The readings for today are well suited to this theme. They challenge and disturb, involve pain and anguish, life crisis as loss and gain, the things that we hold dear, the price of renewal. The book of Job concerns the problem of divine justice when the guiltless suffer and false solutions to this problem. The Hebrews reading concerns the all-seeing, discerning God, effective and potent in our lives, exposing and testing, but as the ensuing verses about Jesus, the high priest, suggest, not without humanity or vulnerability or mercy. The Markan reading concerns the rich young man who, so eager to serve, sorrowfully leaves Jesus because of the pull of his possessions. Psalm 22 is about the anguish of the one who's mocked and outcast from human society and abandoned by God in whom he trusted, with many of the verses quoted by Jesus on the cross. Today I principally want to use the book of Job as a lens for our understanding of mental health, since the book graphically recounts the physical and mental assaults and afflictions that bring humanity down to the dust, break the web of our lives, and cause us to say there's no meaning or sense or purpose. The term mental health is used in two senses. The World Health Organisation definition is a state of complete physical, mental and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease. It incorporates all dimensions of human experience: bio, psycho, social, cultural, developmental, political, ecological, spiritual. Paradoxically, however, mental health is often shorthand for mental illnesses or disorders, problems, predicaments and institutions. Therefore, we can consider mental health and well-being and what promotes these for individuals and groups, and mental illness or disorder and what prevents, ameliorates and enables recovery. I want to particularly consider our connection with each other as foundations for mental health. It's also worth noting that suffering and distress are not the same as disorder, and that the absence of illness is not the presence of health. The rich young man is a case in point. He seems to be in pretty good nick, and potentially excellent recruit, but his attachment to his wealth and possessions prevent him from taking on Jesus' challenge. Grief of different types ranges from health to disorder. Psychiatry and medicine rely on classifications, but sometimes it's very difficult to fix a dividing line. The profile of mental health problems and treatments has been lifted in recent times by various global and local mental health organisations and promotions such as the ABC's Mental As. Yet, consistent with other Western countries, 1 in 5 Australians suffer from a mental health problem at any time, and 1 in 2 in a lifetime, while 50% of mental disorders commence under 15, 75% below 25, and surprisingly few receive any mental health intervention, including suicidal people. Suicide is the commonest cause of death in men and women prior to and in midlife in Australia, while the highest rates are experienced in men over 85, Indigenous people, those living in remote areas, GLBTIQ people, and those leaving psychiatric hospitals and exiting emergency departments having made suicide attempts. Mental disorders have a striking morbidity and mortality. People with schizophrenia, for example, die on average 16 to 20 years earlier than the general population from suicide, but largely because of physical health risks stemming from poor access to medical care, poor diet, little exercise and weight gain related to medication use. Stigma affects so many. For those with severe illnesses such as schizophrenia, bipolar and drug-related psychosis, and those with suicidal behaviour, for marriage and family, social and community life, childcare, employment and work, housing, income, social security, immigration status, access to resources of all kinds are all affected. People with intellectual disabilities, prisoners, asylum seekers, and those with addictions or other groups at increased risk. Contrary to popular perception, most people with mental disorders far more often endure violence than perpetrate it. Men, youths and boys more often die by suicide, have more problems with help seeking and engagement with services. Women and girls are very often victims of physical or sexual violence, are more often refugees from conflict and war, subject to patriarchal or fundamentalist controls, may be unwanted, and more often serve as carers of sick and disabled people. People are cast out, we turn away. There are many conditions and ways of being vulnerable. A 16-year-old young woman with a chronically traumatic upbringing recently described the effect to me as having many planks in your bridge of life missing, which could make it harder to cross the river. There's no close-the-gap strategy in relation to those who suffer severe mental illness and suicidality and their children, parents, siblings, neighbours. We are the lucky country. In low and middle income countries, mental health problems are not only ubiquitous but coexist with poverty, mass trauma and social disruption. People with mental disabilities often live in parlous circumstances, starving, naked, destitute, denied proper hygiene and sanitation, frequently shackled, chained, caged or imprisoned without charge. They may be hidden away or alternatively exposed in public view and ridicule. Such arbitrary confinement and restriction sometimes last for decades. With resources and hope cut off and overwhelmed by shame, families may abandon loved ones to institutions which are not infrequently characterised by physical and sexual abuse, neglect, exploitation through forced labour, injury owing to these things, discrimination and rejection. You'll remember the thumbnail sketch of the book of Job. It's about the righteous patriarchal Oriental sheikh whose life is devastated by catastrophic violence and neglect and accident. God gives Satan leave to find out if Job is blameless and upright, and the patriarch loses his property and family, suffers a revolting skin disease, and sits on the ash heap outside the city. Job's wife advised him to curse God and die. More about this unacknowledged and important person shortly. Job finally breaks his silence with bitter complaint. His three friends arrive to comfort him, but thinking he must be to blame, fail in their mission. A youth named Elihu makes speeches. God appears. Job is challenged, vindicated and restored. It is one of the most profound and perennial treatments of the problem of divine justice and human suffering, ranking with the Greek tragedies and Shakespeare. And it's been the subject of a wealth of critical literature. You can read the poetic version in, for example, chapters 6 and 7, but together with his horrifying skin disease, Job says that his odours are repulsive to his wife and his children are disgusted by his body. Psalm 139's "Where can I flee from your presence?" takes on a different inflection as Job feels either persecuted or abandoned. He suffers anguish, agitation, nightmares, anorexia, insomnia, misery and wishes for death. Let me make a ficto-historical judgment and see his state as melancholy or clinical depression and probably post-traumatic stress. Note that this is not about the suffering of the guilty or the compromised, but that of the innocent. There's a struggle about this. In the book's prologue, Satan cynically asks, does Job fear God for no reason? Touch all that he has, his wealth and possessions, but in the second test of Job, his bone and flesh, and he will curse you to your face. Satan claims no human being is pure. There's an echo with Jesus' rejoinder to the rich young man's opening question, why do you call me good? None is good save God alone. Are Jesus and Satan making the same point? Satan's view of humanity seems Freudian, like the notion of original sin, the idea that we harbour blind instinctual forces rather than a quest for true relationships. Psychoanalytic thinking now repudiates this. However, Satan seems to indulging in another anachronism, that we're all primarily self-regarding characters. There's no disinterested, selfless concern. Researchers have somewhat aridly debated whether true altruism exists or there's always a payback. To be mutually concerned, to empathise, is to ultimately be self-regarding or to lead to feelings of pride and satisfaction. The problem here is circularity. Altruistic acts are performed for selfish reasons, therefore they must be performed for selfish reasons. The element of self-interest in good acts does not equate to being selfish or self-motivated. It's a mean view of humanity. But the classical viewpoint certainly endorses another closely related idea articulated in the Garden of Eden story, that self-sufficiency, self-creation, not formed from each other, let alone from above, the myth of independence and denial of need that can sometimes accompany the most extreme forms of mental suffering. Our sociality, our interdependence are critical to our humanity. The economic case for selfishness can be decisively rejected. Altruism can have pathological manifestations. It can be a defence and sometimes a brittle one. For those who remember Miss Docker and Patrick White's A Cheery Soul will recognise this. Yet the quality of everyday life depends crucially on people who overtly care about the welfare of others. The basis of the difference between Satan and Jesus is the starting point, the dignity of humanity, made in the image and likeness of God. And Jesus, looking at him, loved him, it is said of the rich young man. The dignity of humanity as conferred by its creator, the fact that, as Immanuel Kant said, we could marvel at the starry skies above and the moral law within, the capabilities and potential of humans for good as well as for ill. Job is terrified by the onslaught. As flies to wanton boys are we to the gods, we kill them for our sport, says King Lear. God wages with Satan then is absent. Yet Job holds fast to the hope of goodness and justice in God to which he may appeal, that he should argue with God and meet with reason, understanding and acquittal. From chapter 7 he begins to address God directly, not just statements, declarations, but questions, interrogations. Am I the sea or the dragon that you set a guard over me? Will you not look away from me for a while, yet let me alone while I swallow my spittle? The Old Testament scholar Catherine Schifferdecker sees this as a move from theologising to lament. When God finally appears from the whirlwind, there is nothing except God's power. No purpose in suffering is revealed, or at least rational justification. Why has God acted thus? I think it's possible in the light of the New Testament to say something meaningful about this, that we're in good hands, as Margaret said in concluding a few weeks ago, but that's another story. The book of Job has no theodicy, which is always hard-pressed about why an all-good, all-powerful God would allow the innocent to suffer, or more specifically, for example, permit the Holocaust. Stendhal said cynically, the only excuse for God is that God doesn't exist. Archibald MacLeish, who wrote the play JB, said, I heard it in a yellow wood, if God is God, he is not good. If God is good, he is not God. For the just complaint, there seems to be no listener. Let us particularly remember the tale of horror which no one believes. The messengers in each successive catastrophe who announce, for I alone am escaped to tell the tale. Ariel Dorfman's play, Death and the Maiden, addresses just such a situation with a former torture victim. At this time, many of the asylum-seeking women in Nauru are raped, silenced, receive no health intervention, and are tortured by exposure to their assailants and remaining endangered. They are in just such a situation. What is revealed is that Job does fear God for nothing, strapped to bare existence or less, with nothing material to hold on to, his life in ruins. He has nothing more than integrity and the justice of his complaint. There are some, for example, Jack Miles, who provide a close reading of the text to show that Job may not have repented, but may have withstood God's speech from the whirlwind, and that God's restoration of Job's fortunes is God's own repentance and break with his own wager with the devil. There's a standoff at the end of the book. God never confronts the devil in the epilogue to show that the wager was wrong. The devil just disappears and Job is doubly compensated. Job refuses to abandon an accountable God, a God who knows him even if he does not care about him. This is belief in the midst of pain, grief, terror, desolation and physical illness. The author of the book of Job assumes God, we might say some universal ground, some ultimate concern on which to stand in the worst of times, in horrors and terrors absent yet present. The author grounds faith not merely beyond material wealth and benefit, but beyond immature attachments to God that assume all goodness is owed to us. We as Christians know what this means. While a huge weight of empirical evidence confirms that faith confers better health and relationships and has some protective value for prevention and recovery from physical and mental disorders, Christians and believers generally are not exempted from grief, vulnerability, the effects of trauma as children and adults, and mental disorders. Some are vulnerable because they're victims from persecution and abuse within or outside the church. Many belong to minorities, GLBTI, Indigenous, asylum seekers, for example, that may have added risk. If we know the value of faith, will we, in fact, as churches, stand alone with voiceless people? The divine encounter brings great understandings akin to revelation, despite the lack of cognitive justification that I've referred to. Firstly, the faraway God draws near. To the just complaint there is finally a listener. Even if pain and suffering does not stop, the suffering that's alienation, accusation and doubt may be assuaged. Some mentally ill and suicidal people and asylum seekers whom I have the privilege to know have been to the brink. The effects of extreme suffering are various. It's a treacherous and dangerous territory to navigate. Extreme suffering and horrors may arguably alter who we are, our personality, the ground of our being. But equally, extreme suffering may reveal who we truly are, our common humanity and our need of each other. Both possibilities were present in the wake of the Nazi death camps, for example. Secondly, God's speech to Job negates the idea that suffering results from cosmic reward and punishment. Job's catastrophe is magnified and paradoxically relieved by his refusal of these comforters' false solutions. These men journey with their bodies but not with their minds or spirits. Comforters who, from their position of comfort, don't comfort, who hug the shoreline of received doctrine instead of launching out into the deep. They also have a mean assessment of human beings. Eliphaz speaks of humanity that begets mischief as the sparks fly upward and drinks iniquity like water. Job, refusing them, appeals directly to God. God's verdict in the prologue is, you've not spoken, in the epilogue, is, you've not spoken to me rightly, as has my servant Job. They've argued about God, they've not addressed God, have not appealed their case to God or interceded on Job's behalf. Rather than holding aloof, we may wonder if there are ways in which our approach to people with mental health problems compounds their problems. Coercion, abandonment, judgment, exclusion, othering. Stigma's alive and well in the community and in our health services. Skills training and good information and education may help. Mental health first aid is a pretty good example for this, but we'll all have to avoid easy solutions. For example, while meditation based in Buddhist or early Judeo-Christian practices can certainly improve mental health, our faith traditions being sold out. There are mindfulness groups in many Australian mental health settings now, but there's also evidence that corporates have rebranded mindfulness, which is grounded in ancient practices of spirituality, and made it a solution to overwork, to people's challenge of having to make radical changes in their lives. Employees are being sold meditation to bear the unbearable, to increase productivity and compliance rather than speaking out. Thirdly, this God reveals the sublime majesty, mystery and terror in a universe that's not anthropocentric. The speeches at the end of the book talk about this. In the creation theology, there's a reorientation away from dominion to appreciation and participation. My wife Fran suggested we put our very affectionate grey cat in a cage and bring her along this morning for a show and tell. We should actually be talking probably about the mental health of animals as well. And what of Job's wife? In this patriarchal book we have the names of Job's three daughters, but we don't have his wife's name, just her utterance, witnessing Job's extremity. Do you hold fast to your integrity, curse God and die, or curse God and die by your own hand? Conservative Christian commentators have spoken ill of her. Augustine called her the devil's accomplice, Calvin an instrument of Satan and diabolical fury. She watched her children die. She lost her home and all social standing, became the caregiver for her extremely ill husband, longed for the end of his and her unending, unjustified suffering. She expressed it in 10 words, what he accuses God of in hundreds of words. She's real, she sticks with Job the whole way, and she gets it in her neck. Now, one of the contributors in the Jewish Encyclopedia of this, there's the Midrash on this story as well, says she cannot bear her husband's blind acceptance of the tragedies that befall them. Indeed, the attention to Job's suffering usually ignores the fact that she, after all, is the victim of these tests. And to cling to a model of perfect devotion to a supposedly perfect God whose reality is far from perfection seems to Job's wife to be not exemplary strength but an act of cowardice. Such integrity, she seems to be saying, lacks deeper value. What Job must do is to challenge the God who's afflicted him, even if the consequence is death. Much of the value of the book is its audacious questioning of the ways of God, but we never hear her contribution to the anti-dogmatic bent of the text. She generates the impatience of the dialogues, Job's wife. She opens up the possibility of suspending belief. He comes close to doing what his wife had suggested. He doesn't curse God directly by sinning with his lips, but by cursing his birth, he implicitly curses the Creator who gave him life. Job's wife spurs her husband to doubt God's use of divine powers and does him much good, for this turns out to be the royal road to deepening one's knowledge and opening one's eyes. It's very interesting that in the Midrash, Job's wife receives various degrees of sympathy, and some rabbis, relying on a verbal similarity between the two verses that portray two women, identify her with Dinah, the daughter of Jacob and Leah, who was raped. The modern scholar Yitzhak Heinemann understands this identification as meant to explain the wife's bitter words as resulting from the calamity she had experienced before her marriage. The social preconditions of mental health have been missing from the wider picture, notably compassionate responses to women and children who are abused or neglected, those who seek refuge from war and mass trauma, post-conflict reconciliation and reconstruction. To date, the goal of providing universal support to promote the capabilities of those with mental disorders, and including those who have been socially isolated because of severe mental illness, remains a distant ideal. The mental health system is dysfunctional in Australia and various Western countries. And in some poor countries it's dominated by antiquated hospitals or pretty much non-existent. It is economics. It's a matter of putting money into community agencies, not just health, but housing, education, social services, etc. People are falling through the cracks. We need systems that work in the community and in hospitals, funded research in mental health and suicide prevention. The Prime Minister and the new ministry have made some encouraging signs that they'll target some of the fundamental underpinnings of mental illness, domestic violence, for example. But despite some reforms and some service initiatives, it remains to be seen whether our leaders will grasp the nettle in relation to affordable housing, basic social support for young people, refugees. It really doesn't look at this point that the asylum seeker situation will change greatly from the top, so we're going to have to shake the tree from the bottom. We need to remember, as we draw this to a close, that we are in good hands, as Margaret reminded us a number of weeks ago, and that in Victor Hugo's words, to love another person is to see the face of God.